Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, anyways, man, I thought that I would kind of review this list because I found it interesting. There's always a lot of talks about who the greatest boxer is of all time or who the GOAT is of their sport, the greatest of all time, whatever it may be. Excuse me, for boxing, that's a little bit hard to discuss when it comes down to it, in my opinion, about who is for sure the undisputed greatest of all time. To be quite honest with you, I'm not sure if there's really an undisputed greatest of all time in any sport that I've seen, not even basketball or football or UFC. There's almost no undisputed GOAT in any sport, at least that I can personally think of when it comes down to it. So I don't know, maybe that's just my view, but we're gonna see this list. DAZN recently came out with a list overall, and they came out with a list of their top 10 boxers of the past 30 years. Now this is 30 years, so this means all the 90s, all the 2000s, and all the 2010s as well. So this is going to exclude certain boxers like Marvin Hagler, probably Sugar Ray Leonard, Tommy Hearns, Roberto Duran, and maybe even Julio Cesar Chavez, because I think by the time of the 90s, I think Chavez, maybe I'm mistaken, but I think Chavez overall, I think he was starting to wear down a little bit. So, it is what it is. Anyway, when it comes down to it, we're going to see overall what they have to say. Let's get into this list. Let's see overall what they have to say. Let's see if I can scroll down here. So, I don't know if we're really going to read this part overall. But then here we go at number 10, we have Saul Canelo Alvarez. And I'll read it. It says, coming in at number 10, Saul Alvarez remains one of the most fearsome fighters to have laced up a pair of gloves this decade and has been since the mid-2000s. Despite being humbled by Floyd Mayweather in 2013, since that loss, Canelo has taken apart Gennady Golovkin, also known as Triple G, Miguel Cotto, and Sergey Kovalev, effectively ending Billy Joe Saunders' career of late also, and still only 31, the Mexican can yet accomplish far more. Now, if you're asking me overall, because we're kind of ranking this list, do I agree that Saul Canelo Alvarez is one of the top 10 boxers of the past 30 years? What I'm going to say is this. For some of you that maybe would put him just off the list, I would maybe understand. But I think, in my opinion, overall, I probably would have to put him on this list. Just put him on this list. Some people may disagree, but when I take a look at the 2010s, I think the number one pound for pound fighter in the 2010s would probably have to be Floyd Mayweather Jr. When I take a look at the number two pound for pound fighter of the 2010s, I would probably have to say it's Canelo Alvarez, and some people may disagree. They may say overall that it's Manny Pacquiao, but Manny Pacquiao just suffered way too many losses in the 2010s for me to really put him above a Canelo Alvarez. And Canelo had so many big wins, like especially over Gennady Golovkin. Like that win over Gennady Golovkin that he had, Gennady Golovkin at the time, almost on every single list, was ranked within the top 5 pound for pound. I don't think there's one fighter that you can say that Manny Pacquiao defeated in the 2010 era that was within the top 5 pound for pound. I don't think he ever had a win like that in his career. Now, granted, I do think Canelo Alvarez lost the first fight against Gennady Golovkin, but at least he can say that, in my opinion, he also beat him in the rematch because I thought Canelo won the rematch. So, it is what it is. So, this is my personal opinion. I do believe overall that Canelo Alvarez is within this frame. Some people may disagree, but when you're talking about him compared to even some other great fighters, he's going to end out on top. There's been some great fighters, even though this generation, like Vasily Lomachenko, Terrence Crawford, overall that have been fighting for the number one pound for pound spot. Errol Spence Jr. as well, and a few others. If you guys want to include some others, but those are the main ones overall that have been probably competing for the number one pound for pound spot for the past few years. And Canelo has really came out on top out of all of them, in my opinion. Now, some people may disagree, but that's just my view. Canelo Alvarez overall clearly has been the most dominant out of all of them, in my opinion. He's faced the best competition. Overall, you can debate that he's the most skilled out of all those fighters when it comes down to it. And he's just accomplished a great amount. So, Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, right now, he is the face of boxing. And if you're asking me, do I agree with him being at the number 10 spot? I personally do agree with him being at the number 10 spot. And actually, this is my opinion, even though some people may disagree. You can actually argue him higher on this list, and a certain amount of people may disagree with that. But let's just see overall what they have to say. But I understand why they have him only at the number 10 spot, because Canelo, he is only 31 years old. There is a certain amount more that he is going to have to prove in his career. So we'll see what happens. But anyway, so let's go to number 9. And by the way, overall, before we move on to this, people will talk about how Gennady Golovkin was 37 years old. Yes, Gennady Golovkin was 37 years old, but he was a good 37 years old. Gennady Golovkin overall was pretty much at the peak of his career. And a certain amount of people are going to disagree with me on that. The same people that try to detract, like Dante's Boxing Nation, for example, the same people, pretty much the DBC and new media, the pro-black boxing mafia, let's be real, it is what it is. When it comes down to it overall, they try to detract from Canelo, and they tried to say overall that he fought a bunch of old guys like Gennady Golovkin and Miguel Cotto and Sergey Kovalev. Well, sure, they were older, but they were still very decent points in their career. Now, what Dante will tell you, when one of the fighters that he likes, in Yordenis Ugas, when he just recently defeated Manny Pacquiao, when Manny Pacquiao was almost 43 years of age, what did he say? He said, well, the facts are the facts. Manny Pacquiao just got beat by the better fighter. That's what he said. But when Canelo Alvarez, when he beats Gennady Golovkin or beats Miguel Cotto or beats Sergey Kovalev, they're all washed up, even though they were all younger than Manny Pacquiao. But it is what it is. Anyways, my point being is this. Gennady Golovkin was one of the top pound-for-pound fighters in the world at the time. Miguel Cotto, even though I wouldn't necessarily say that he was at his absolute peak, he was still at a very decent point in his career, and Canelo Alvarez just thoroughly outboxed him. And then, of course, you have Sergey Kovalev. Now, is this the Sergey Kovalev that, in my opinion, fought Andre Ward? No, it's not the same Sergey Kovalev, but it was still a very decent version of himself. It is what it is. So you have to give Canelo Alvarez a lot of credit there. So that's what I'm going to say there. And Billy Joe Saunders is another elite opponent as well. So Canelo, in my opinion, very, very great fighter. Okay, now number 9 is Evander Holyfield. And let's overall see what they have to say here. The only man to hold world titles in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, many consider former cruiserweight Evander Holyfield the greatest in the division's history. Well, I'm not going to consider him that. I think actually that's a little bit ridiculous. In fact, some people may heavily disagree with me here. I actually may put Canelo Alvarez over Evander Holyfield. And a lot of people are going to disagree with me because, of course, Evander, he has quite a big fan base, especially because he defeated Mike Tyson. What I'm going to say is this. Canelo Alvarez right now is the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. I don't know ever one point in time in the sport where Evander Holyfield would have been the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. Now, if one of you guys wants to correct me on that, you can correct me. But besides the Mike Tyson win, and he did get one win against Riddick Bowe, I believe, but besides that, Evander Holyfield actually lost some of the bigger fights in his career. And let's be real, that win over Mike Tyson, it is a great win, but Mike Tyson, he was pretty much known as a guy that would implode every time he was in a big matchup. Because Mike Tyson, he never beat an A-grade fighter in his career. That's just the bottom line. At least one that was in their peak. And I like Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson is what got me into boxing. But Evander, should he be on this list? You can seriously debate that he should be on this list. I'm not sure if I would even put him above Canelo, though. And some people would heavily disagree with that. But that's my opinion. It is what it is. Anyways, but then, of course, it says he, of course, better known as a heavyweight, but stands out from that particular crowd also, making a bigger name for himself with boxing's big men rivalries with Riddick Bowe, Michael Moore, and infamously Mike Tyson. Saw the man with huge heart upset the odds on more than one occasion. That's also another fight I believe that he lost. I believe he lost against Michael Moore, but if someone can correct me, because I can't exactly remember, I do believe he lost against Michael Moore. But correct me if I'm wrong. Anyway. Having made his comeback in his exhibition bouts this summer, Holyfield, a true legend of the sport. All right, well, so they have Evander at 9. I don't think that that's the worst ranking, but you can argue him. You can switch him and Canelo, in my opinion. And a lot of people, once again, will disagree with that, but it is what it is. Number 8, Lennox Lewis. Arguably the best heavyweight during the 90s. Hammersmith-born Lennox Lewis was a ring general. No, he's not arguably the best heavyweight of the 90s. He is the best heavyweight of the 90s. He also was the best heavyweight of the early to mid-2000s. Lennox Lewis, you can debate as the best heavyweight of all time. A lot of people are going to disagree with me on that. Now, would I necessarily put him above a Muhammad Ali, who I thought possibly was more skilled than him? No, personally, I wouldn't. But Lennox Lewis was, there is no question, he was the best heavyweight of his time. Lennox Lewis, in my opinion, actually is one of the more underrated fighters in history. He actually should be a little bit higher on this list because, in my opinion, Lennox Lewis, he was for sure the best heavyweight of the 90s. There really is no ifs, ands, or buts about that. There's not one heavyweight you can put above him, in my opinion. You can't put Evander above him because Evander was never able to beat him. You can't put Riddick Bowe above him because Riddick Bowe didn't accomplish quite what he did. And on top of that, Riddick Bowe didn't really want to face him. You can't put Mike Tyson above him because Mike Tyson never really won any of the big fights in his career. There is no heavyweight in a very talented heavyweight era. There is no heavyweight that was greater than Lennox Lewis during that era. You know, Lennox Lewis is in one of my top three. He is in my top three heavyweights of all time. That's my personal opinion. My top three heavyweights of all time are Muhammad Ali, Rocky Marciano, and Lennox Lewis. And whichever way you want to rank those guys is your business. All right, that's my opinion on the situation. Once again, a lot of people may disagree. That's just personally the way that I rank it. But let's just see overall what else they have to say. Further wins over legendary names such as Holyfield and Tyson would follow before Lewis left the sport on his own terms, albeit with a disputed stoppage win over Vitaly Klitschko in 2003. Let's just forget any mention of Hasim Rahman. Well, Hasim Rahman, and some people overall may bring that up, that he ended up getting knocked out by Oliver McCall earlier on in his career, and also by Hasim Rahman. Lennox Lewis overall, there was a couple of fights in his career where he did slip up. But one thing that is important to say about Lennox Lewis, every person that he faced, he beat. So that means in the rematch with Oliver McCall, he won. And in the rematch with Hasim Rahman, he got an extraordinary knockout. Lennox Lewis also was one of the most skilled heavyweights of all time, in my opinion. Very tactical, very technical, decently strong, great athlete. The only thing I would maybe say about Lennox Lewis is that I didn't always think that he had the greatest chin. I'm not going to necessarily say he was as chinny as, say, of Vladimir Klitschko, but he could be hurt. You know, it is what it is. In my opinion, Lennox Lewis actually should be higher on this list. I think actually Lennox Lewis overall has been a little bit underrated in his career. But, you know, it is what it is. And I think a part of that might be also because he's a British fighter. British fighters tend to be a little bit underrated, in my opinion, depending on who it is. So, it is what it is. So, this next one, Felix Trinidad. Excuse me. Felix Trinidad, of course, the Puerto Rican boxer that was mainly, great during the 90s and also during the early 2010s. I believe he was undefeated until he faced Bernard Hopkins. He was a champion throughout, I believe, at least three divisions when it came down to it. Now, in my opinion, before we even read this list, Felix Trinidad probably his skill set wasn't as elite as some other boxers that I've seen on this list, maybe. Certain times he did have problems with certain styles. Like if you've seen the Oscar De La Hoya fight, I thought Oscar De La Hoya completely controlled the first half of the fight. And then in the second half, I probably still would have gave it to De La Hoya, but De La Hoya was kind of moving around a little bit too much, in my opinion. But it's been so long since I've watched that fight, so I would have to watch it again. Anyways, when it comes down to it, let's read overall what they have to say here. Cuban boxers have often been the biggest performers on the amateur stage, but few cross the divide into professional boxing with more aplomb than Felix Trinidad and over multiple weight divisions. Enjoying one of the best welterweight runs of the modern era, Trinidad then had memorable wins at light middleweight over David Reed and Fernando Vargas before jumping to middleweight in similarly dominant manner. A loss to Bernard Hopkins in 2001 was the signal of the beginning of the end, but nevertheless, the Cuban will go down as one of the most versatile boxers in history. That's the thing. Now, maybe I'm wrong about this. I don't think Felix Trinidad actually was Cuban. I'm pretty sure he was Puerto Rican. So that actually seems like a big mistake there by this list. I'm a little bit surprised that they didn't know that because Felix Trinidad was very, very, very big in the 90s and very big in the 2000s as well when he was fighting there. Maybe he has Cuban lineage that I don't know of. But I'm pretty sure he was born in Puerto Rico. Pretty sure he was born in Puerto Rico. But yeah, I'll have to do my research on that. But yeah, I'm a little bit surprised overall that they had in there. Anyways, would I have Felix Trinidad this high on the list? You could argue this. I don't think that this is a bad spot. Felix Trinidad at one point in time could have been debatably, to some people, the number one pound-for-pound fighter in the world. So I don't necessarily have a problem with this listing. Like I said, Felix Trinidad, with certain styles, he would have problems. Like I said, his skill sets wasn't necessarily on a Mayweather level, in my opinion, but Felix Trinidad overall, he was very talented. He was a very decent athlete. He did beat some very, very talented boxers. He ended up getting the nod over Oscar De La Hoya in a fight that a lot of people thought that he lost, but it is what it is. Oscar kind of made it a little bit closer because I don't know if he necessarily 100% did enough in that second half of the fight, but it is what it is. He also beat Fernando Vargas, who I believe actually was favored to beat him. He beat a certain amount of other very talented boxers as well. Felix Trinidad certainly, in my opinion, deserves to be on this top 10 list. This is probably the perfect spot for him. I don't disagree with this. And let's go to number 6. Of course, the golden boy, pretty boy, Oscar De La Hoya. A multi-weight division champion, perhaps now more famous for his promoting than his fighting, Oscar De La Hoya was the golden boy of the Barcelona Olympics in 1992. Not one single occasion during his pro career did the Californian dodge a single opponent. A major attraction in the fight game during the late 90s and the subsequent decade to follow, De La Hoya bowed out of the sport as a box office fighter during 2008 after losing to Manny Pacquiao. In retirement, however, Golden Boy Promotions have seen De La Hoya become as successful a promoter as he was in the ring himself, a huge driving force behind the era of Saul Alvarez. Excuse me. So, do I agree with Oscar De La Hoya being at number 6? What I'm going to say is this. Whoever you want to debate over who, if you want to debate Oscar De La Hoya over Felix Trinidad, that's your business. If you want to debate Felix Trinidad over Oscar De La Hoya, that's your business. In my personal opinion, because he has less losses in his career, I'm not necessarily saying that Felix Trinidad was as talented as Oscar De La Hoya, but this is my view. I probably would put Felix Trinidad above Oscar De La Hoya in my view. I also may have Lennox Lewis above Oscar De La Hoya. In my opinion, now some people disagree with this. Some people think that he's been underrated in his career. Some people think that he's been overrated. I think it depends where you rank him. And to be honest with you, I think number 6 is a little bit too high for Oscar because he just lost a little bit too many of the big fights in his career. I thought that he definitely lost to Shane Mosley, no doubt about it. Now, the rematch I thought Oscar won, but, it is what it is. He also lost to Floyd Mayweather Jr. I thought that he lost that fight. I'm trying to think of another fight. He lost to Bernard Hopkins, obviously. Of course, Felix Tito Trinidad did as well. But, it is what it is. I'm trying to think overall of who else. Of course, he lost to Manny, but I'll give Oscar a little bit of a pass on that one because he was supremely weight drained, and overall, it just was not a great night for him. I'm sorry, but to me, Oscar, he just lost a little bit too many big fights in his career. Like I said, he lost to Shane Mosley. Overall, when it came down to it, he lost to Floyd Mayweather Jr., lost to Manny Pacquiao, lost to Felix Tito Trinidad. I'm sorry, but I can't have you at number 6 with all those losses. It's not even like a Manny Pacquiao situation where Manny Pacquiao has 8 losses in his career now, and he's won the majority of his big fights. When you talk about the majority of the big fights in Oscar's career, I thought he lost them. Now, he does have a win over, I believe, Ike Corte. And now, personally, I've never actually seen that match, so I would have to watch that. I watched the Pernell Whitaker one as well, because I know some people, they're going to bring this up. Well, he won over Pernell Whitaker, he won over Ike Corte. I personally thought he lost a Pernell Whitaker fight, but, it is what it is. And then also, I'm trying to think of what else. He beat Ike Corte. A lot of people thought he lost that fight, but once again, I'm going to have to rewatch that one myself. I personally thought Pernell Whitaker did enough to get the decision over him, but it is what it is. And then, like I said, the Ike Corte one I've never watched. Now, Oscar De La Hoya, he did put the beating on, some decent fighters, but I wouldn't really say, all-time great fighters like Fernando Vargas and Ricardo Mayorga and Arturo Gatti. Although all those guys were decent fighters, but I'm not necessarily sure if you would 100% call those guys, great fighters. Some people may disagree, but what those guys pretty much were known for is losing almost every big fight in their career. With the exception of Ricardo Mayorga beating Vernon Forrest in 2 big upsets. But, it is what it is. Anyway, excuse me. And of course, I believe Fernando Vargas, I think he beat Winky Wright, who was a very decent fighter during his day as well. Anyways, my point being is this. I would not personally have Oscar De La Hoya this high. in my opinion. But it is what it is. Anyway. Number 5, Sweet Pea, Pernell Whitaker. Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker. Let's see what it says. Pernell Whitaker was a rare breed, renowned for his defensive genius rather than ferocious power. The Virginian nickname Sweet Pea was an Olympic gold medalist at Los Angeles in 1984 and entered the 90s as one of boxing's best, and his performances did not suffer age after 2000. Even past his best, Whitaker troubled the likes of De La Hoya and Trinidad before finally hanging up the gloves in 2001 after breaking his collarbone. Tragically killed in 2019 after crossing the road, the word great has never been used in more fitting fashion. Do I agree with Pernell Whitaker being a number 5? I personally do. I personally would put him over Trinidad and also personally would put him over Oscar De La Hoya. I do believe he was a 4-weight division champion, Pernell Sweet Pea. Now, he lost to De La Hoya, but in my opinion, I actually personally thought he won that fight. Here's also my thing. Sweet Pea Whitaker at one point in time, you can debate that he was the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter, and when he defeated Julio Cesar Chavez, Chavez was one of the he was one of the sport's top fighters. And I thought Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker pretty much embarrassed Chavez. Now, of course, that was scored a draw, but I thought it was wrongfully scored a draw. My bottom line is this. I thought Sweet Pea Whitaker, I thought overall that he was one of the world's most skilled fighters. I personally believe overall that he should be above both Trinidad and Oscar De La Hoya. That's my personal view. Now, some people may disagree with that, but in my opinion, Pernell Whitaker, you could definitely say at one point in time that he could have definitely been the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Trinidad, you can maybe argue that as well. Oscar, I'm not really ever sure if you could argue that he was the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, but he would have been like number 2, number 3, somewhere around there. And some people may disagree with me on that. Some people overall may say, what are you talking about? When he defeated Sweet Pea Whitaker, overall he was considered the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, but I'm not so sure about that. Because I think at the time then, Roy Jones Jr. might have been counted as the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. So I'm not sure who I'm sure we'll see on this list as well. Excuse me. Anyway, but let's move on. Number 4, Bernard Hopkins. Ooh, man. All right, well, let's read it. Bernard Hopkins has been proving people wrong since day one. Losing his debut bout, Hopkins then carved out a career that saw him fighting at the top level well into his 50s. Felix Trinidad, Antonio Tarver, and Kelly Pavlik all felt the force of the executioner, and who was a huge underdog during his biggest wins down the years. As a testament to his obvious character, despite suffering a split decision defeat to Joe Calzaghe in 2008, Hopkins continued to fight the best, and though outclassed by a rising Sergey Kovalev a full 6 years later, was rarely out of the upper echelons of boxing. Finally came calling time on his particular dance in 2016. Hopkins was one of the toughest fighters of the past 3 decades. I've never been that big on Bernard Hopkins personally. Certain people may disagree. I do think Bernard Hopkins is a Hall of Famer. I do think overall that he clearly is an all-time great. But I find him usually to be very overrated in these lists, and I don't really find it any different here. I would not put him above Sweet Pea Whitaker. I maybe would put him over Felix Tito Trinidad, because obviously he beat Tito Trinidad. Now, personally, I always thought Bernard Hopkins, I always thought he may have been a little bit of a weight bully, but maybe that's just me. It is what it is. Bernard Hopkins also did lose some of the bigger fights in his career. He lost to a prime Roy Jones Jr., he also lost to Jermaine Taylor when he was at a very decent point in his career. He also lost to Joe Calzaghe. Now, a certain amount of people are going to be saying, well, yeah, sure, but that was when he was older. You know? Well, that was when Bernard Hopkins was getting very decently big wins, like over Antonio Tarver. All right, so if you're going to count those great wins that he has over Antonio Tarver, then guess what? He's still at a very decent point in his career if he fights Joe Calzaghe a couple of fights later. He also lost to Chad Dawson. All right? Bernard Hopkins, in my opinion, all-time great fighter, no doubt about it, but he should not be a number 4. I don't see him above Sweet Pea Whitaker. To be honest with you, I'm not even sure if I see him above Lennox Lewis. That's my personal opinion. Some people may disagree on that, but that's my opinion. Like Lennox Lewis, once again, 100% for sure, was the best of a very talented heavyweight division. Bernard Hopkins, in my opinion, I'm not sure why he's this high, because you can argue at one point in time that Felix Tito Trinidad, that maybe he was the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. You also can argue that with Sweet Pea Whitaker. You can never argue that with Bernard Hopkins. I'm sorry, you can never argue that he was the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. It's not going to happen. It never happened. And that's why, in my opinion, he should not be at number 4. He probably is the most overrated guy on this list. And a lot of people are going to disagree with me on that, but that's the way that I see it. Anyways, let's move on. Number 3, Roy Jones Jr. All right, let's see overall what they have to say. One of the most dominant men in the ring throughout the 90s. Actually, he's one of the most dominant men in sports history, not even just in boxing. Let me say that. Roy Jones Jr. could have been perhaps the very, very best had he remained at the heavyweight for the duration. A champion at middleweight, super middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight during his storied career, Jones was one of the most feared opponents in boxing in a circle which included Mike Tyson. After dominating boxing up until the early 2000s, however, Jones suffered a staggering fall from grace, having claimed the WBA heavyweight crown in 2003 to become the first man in that division to claim the belt after starting out at light middleweight. Jones Jr.'s decisions to drop down a weight proved to be his eventual downfall. Initially beating Antonio Tarver the year before, but he was knocked out in the 2004's rematch, the first time he had been stopped during his career. What I'm going to say about Roy Jones Jr. is this, in my opinion. Roy Jones Jr., you can argue, is the most dominant boxer during his peak. I'm not sure if there's actually any argument about that. Now, some people may say Manny Pacquiao, some people may say Floyd Mayweather Jr., some people may say Muhammad Ali. I don't think I can put any of those same guys just in terms of dominance. That doesn't mean that, in my opinion, you're greater than those guys. But what I'm going to say is this. Just like if you were to watch basketball, there's so many people that say that Shaquille O'Neal was the most dominant player that they ever seen, but no one put Shaquille O'Neal above Michael Jordan. At least, not usually when it comes down to it. But that's the thing. Shaq, when you watched him during the early 2000s, he was the most dominant force that you had ever seen. It's the same thing here. Roy Jones Jr., when I seen him fight, man, now, of course, I was not, really around to watch him, throughout his whole entire peak or whatever. But when it came down to it, I've watched a lot of his fights. I have never seen a fighter as dominant as Roy Jones Jr. Roy Jones Jr., in my opinion, and some people may disagree, clearly a top 10 boxer of all time. Some people may disagree. They may put others up above there. Roy Jones Jr. was very clearly the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter of the 90s. There is no doubt about that. There is no debate about that. Roy Jones Jr. was the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter of the 90s and also the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter all the way up until 2004. I mean, Roy Jones Jr. had the number 1 pound-for-pound position for such a long time. It is what it is. Anyway, Roy Jones Jr., you can even argue him higher on this list, man, if you wanted to. You seriously could. Roy Jones Jr. is that great in my opinion. But let's see who they have at number 2. Let's see. Oh, I guess they have more. Okay, my bad. In his attempt for an immediate return as champion later that year, Jones' age then caught up with them, suffering a damaging and humbling KO loss to IBF champ Glenn Johnson. A further loss to Tarver, then rather paved his way toward more defeat to come. Though victory did come against Jeff Left Hook Lacey, both Calzaghe and Hopkins took the scalp of then the fallen idol. Further ignominy at cruiserweight then followed, but he showed against Tyson in their exhibition bout last year. Jones Jr. will still go down as one of the best. Absolutely. No doubt about it in my view. Anyway, Floyd Mayweather Jr. Excuse me. In my opinion, and this is my view, he should probably be the number 1 fighter of the past 30 years. A lot of people are going to disagree. I believe personally that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is the most skilled fighter of the past 30 years. And on top of that, Floyd Mayweather Jr., he never suffered a defeat, even though some people would argue that, maybe he could have suffered a loss. But bottom line is this, Floyd Mayweather Jr., he is undefeated. I thought he was excellent offensively. I thought he was excellent defensively. And he's defeated some of the world's most skilled opponents. He's a 5 weight division champion. All right? So Floyd Mayweather Jr. is no joke. In my opinion, they should have him at number 1. But let's read overall what they have here. Arguably one of the best pound-for-pound fighters in boxing history. Well, he's not arguably one of the best. He is one of the best. It's certain. there is no debate there. Who remains undefeated? Floyd Mayweather Jr., however, only comes in at 2nd spot. Finally achieving his goal after defeating Oscar De La Hoya in 2007, his pretty boy Monkier made his way for his Money Mayweather since the turn of the decade as he became a global household name in boxing. Though his bronze medal at the Atlanta Olympics remains something of a blot, comparatively speaking, during his formative years, Mayweather Jr. has gone on to defeat not only De La Hoya and ring warrior Miguel Cotto during his career, but also remains the only man in the sport to have beaten Canelo Alvarez. Well, in my opinion, there's a couple of people who possibly defeated Canelo Alvarez, but it is what it is. Anyway, with further wins over Ricky Hatton, Shane Mosley, and Juan Manuel Marquez to his name, his victory over Manny Pacquiao in 2015 was career-defining, even if perhaps both men were past their very best. Well, they were both still very decent at very decent points in their career. Floyd is the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, and Manny Pacquiao is one of the top 10 pound-for-pound fighters in the world as well. So, it is what it is. Anyways, if you can dispute his position in this countdown, indeed, some would have him top. I absolutely would have him on top. Yes, I would. Anyway. And number 1, Manny Pacquiao. Manny Pacquiao, in my opinion, he is going to be top 3 within this list. You could debate Roy Jones Jr. or Floyd Mayweather Jr. over him, in my opinion. Some people would disagree with the Roy Jones Jr. one. I certainly would put Floyd above him. Let me just say that. I certainly would put Floyd above him. No doubt about that in my mind. But anyways, it is the current face of politics in the Philippines and one of the most famous visages on the entire Asian continent in Manny Pacquiao, however, who wins this particular fight, recently defeated by Yordan Sugas while trying to win yet another world title. His ring rust is finally showing, but Pac-Man has built a remarkable legacy in boxing. I do agree with that. Extraordinary, converting from flyweight to light middleweight without missing a single beat or indeed punch. Pacquiao has taken apart numerous legends of the ring along the way, but it is his incredible rise from nowhere that continues to dumbfound. His duo fights with Eric Morales and Marco Antonio Pereira will likely make the list of greatest fights of all time, but in the same instance, his defeats of both men were resounding and spectacular. Twice defeating Marquez, like Mayweather, he also beat Hatton, Mosley, and Cotto, but Pacquiao's ring speed sets him miles apart from the crowd, and his hand speed left many in a trance. Well, like I said, Manny Pacquiao is within top 3 for this list, but I don't think I can have him at number 1. A lot of people overall would disagree, but that's just my opinion there. So, I don't know. That's just my view of this list overall. But anyways, let me know overall what you guys think. Personally, who would I have at number 1? I would probably have Floyd. Number 2, I would either have Manny Pacquiao or Roy Jones Jr. Number 4, excuse me. Number 4, I certainly would not have Bernard Hopkins there, even though some people would disagree. I would either have Sweet Pea Whitaker, Felix Trinidad, or Lennox Lewis there. So, one of those guys. And I'm trying to think of who else. Oscar, I would have it about 7 or 8, somewhere around there. Let's see, Evander Holyfield, I would probably have at 10. And Canelo, I think you can debate at 9, even though some people would disagree. But if you were to keep Canelo at 10, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. Anyways, man, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I just thought that I would talk about this list. Anyways, that's really about it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll have to talk to you all later.